Whistling 5 Anarchic Productions proudly presents Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s stories, as told by Andrew Brammer. Hello and welcome. The story you are about to hear is written and told using its original source materials, scribblings and scratchings from the scrawls of Stumpy, found within Stumpy Sanderson's time capsule, which was buried in 1979 and then unearthed in 2019. The story is told in the first person, as I, just like Stumpy, witnessed at first hand the momentous events which it recounts. So let's park up our rally choppers and tomahawks and take a ride back to 1978 for the great freight train adventure. Of all the great train journeys in the world, the Orient Express, the Chicago to Californian Zephyr, the Trans-Siberian Express, few have been as hair-raising as the great freight train adventure which took place in the early summer of 1978. For many years, it had been one of our dreams and ambitions to somehow hitch a ride on the back of one of the Blue Circle cement carriages that were pulled a few times a day by mighty Deltic diesel engine trains, back and forth along the railway line that stood at the foot of Blows Downs. Never, though, in our wildest dreams, did we ever believe this ambition would be fulfilled. Until one very warm evening in the last week of summer term, when Stumpy Sanderson, Puffer Patterson and I had been walking along that very railway line. Puffing away on our rasping guards' cigarettes, we were busy discussing the previous evening's triumph, when Puffer, who was the greatest actor of our school and of his generation, and a working-class boy with definite upper-middle-class aspirations, had given a bravura performance as Falstaff in the drama group's sparsely attended end-of-year showing of Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1. As we were all debating and racking our brains as to how we could and should all be celebrating more to give Puffer the public accolades he deserved for this tour de force, our thoughts and discussions were interrupted when we saw in the near distance a quite astonishing sight, for approaching us was a gaggle of younger boys from the year below us, boys from one of the posher parts of town, and who were quite unlike the other urchins and miscreants who frequented the territory of Blows Downs, 4 of whom were pulling along the railway tracks by rope, one of the most astonishing contraptions we had ever laid eyes on. This contraption was a large, bare, steel square, measuring roughly about 6 feet by 6, on top and at the front of which had been fixed a thin tubular metal-framed barrier, high enough for 3 of the boys to be holding onto it as a type of handlebar as they stood on top of the square. The ropes had been attached to this handlebar, but the genius of the design was the guidance and transportation system. For underneath the steel garage door were 2 runners that ran the full length of the square, and which were constructed from rectangular steel ducting pipe, just a bit wider than the gauge of the railway line. These runners had had their bottom lengths of steel removed so that they sat on and over the railway tracks, and we later learned they had also been lined with waxed rubber so that when pulled, the whole contraption would move easily along the twin tracks of the railway line. As the boys reached nearer to us, Puffer recognised one of them, a fellow member of the school's drama group, and indeed a possible eventual successor to Puffer, as the greatest actor and barnstormer of his generation, and who had acted opposite him as Prince Hal in the previous night's production. "Good evening, my dear fellow, and may I ask, what on earth is that?" asked the portly Puffer, with one hand removing his monocle and the other flamboyantly gesturing towards the contraption. His fellow actor, a small and wiry boy with a sunken face and a pudding bowl haircut, gracefully bowed, and, doffing a non-existent cap, proudly answered, "This, my good gentlemen and gentlemen, is our railway chariot, ingeniously constructed by our team here from an old garage door we found dumped in the trees way back yonder, and some steel ducting and framework which we purchased from Carter's scrapyard. Constructed using the techniques, learning and skills which we have picked up in technology and metalwork, and ably assisted by two of our elder brothers, who are in their third year of their advanced engineering and design apprenticeships at Bedford Trucks." "What's it for, though?" Puffer queried. "Well, my good sir," answered the boy, "it is simply to transport us along these railway lines of an evening, to enable those of us riding it to take a leisurely ride and take in and enjoy the scenery." Whilst it was astonishing to watch this great thespian jousting by these two titans of the stage, Stumpy had heard enough and decided to interject. It could, of course, be put to better use, and as Stumpy had then proceeded to explain his brainwave and thinking to us and the younger boys, they had looked on goggle-eyed, awestruck and humbled at the sheer derring-do and genius of the plan. Boys of their ilk never had the ingenuity nor daring for such a scheme. Indeed, when Stumpy had finished his presentation, the lead boy had simply said, "You would do this for us? If so, my good sir, it would indeed be an honour to loan you all our chariot for this purpose." And so that's how, 2 evenings later, we found ourselves ready for one of the greatest operations that Blowsdowns would ever witness, and with it, our chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Firstly, to fulfill our long-held ambition to eventually be able to hitch a ride on the back of one of those cement carriages pulled by a mighty Deltic diesel. Secondly, the chance to be able to give Puffer the opportunity to bask in deserved glory and receive and accept the accolades for that phenomenal performance as Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1. Now, Stumpy's plan was of stunning simplicity and ingenuity. We would wait in hiding in amongst the dense clumps of trees at the side of the track, chariot in waiting, at the point where the track curved and arced round a large sweeping bend, waiting for that freight train with its long trail of 20 or so cylindrically shaped grey cement trucks with their blue and yellow blue circle cement logos. This train was always the last of the evening, never had a manned guards van at the end of it, and always reached the particular destination where we would be in cover at exactly 7:35 p.m. every night. At this specific place in the track, the train would rumble by at a really slow pace, before it would then begin to accelerate to a medium speed once it then hit the straight section of track that ran in parallel to the backs of the Jeans Way houses. So, Stumpy's plan was that, as the train slowly passed us, we would all manoeuvre the chariot out into position on the tracks and would then hitch it with ropes to the rear coupling arrangements of the last cement carriage. Then would come our run of glory. For Stumpy, Puffer and I would stand upright in position on the chariot, all holding on to the metal handlebar barrier, and as the train lumbered on its way, we would travel along the whole foot of the downs, where Stumpy had spread word, so that a huge crowd of admirers and well-wishers would be gathered, in order for Puffer to then flamboyantly wave and accept the plaudits and cheering of the crowd and his admirers. After this run of glory, we would be able to jump off and uncouple the chariot, when it eventually reached the bridge that ran over Skimpot Road on the Luton border, as we knew that the trains always slowed down to a snail's pace as they travelled over that bridge. So, like the great train robbers, the younger boys, Stumpy, Puffer and I, now hid, well concealed from view in the very warm early evening, amongst the dense trees that stood along the side of the track, waiting to spring into action. What a plan! What a momentous event in store for us all! What could possibly go wrong? What possible spanners could be thrown into our works? The first spanner was that, for whatever reason, the train was late. Much later than usual. And as we waited, first expectantly, excitedly, and patiently, and then with increasing frustration, it wasn't until nearly 10 to 8 when we could finally hear it coming round the large curve. What we also heard was that the engine sounded far louder than normal, emitting a horrible clanking and grinding sound that didn't sound at all right, meaning that we could hear the train way before we could see it. With the awful noise it was making, we quickly put 2 and 2 together and deduced that the reason the train was running late was that it must have developed some sort of mechanical issue. Then, as the huge and imposing green and yellow diesel engine passed us in our hiding place, like some enormous mechanical monster, breathing out its heavy fumes, the sound was deafening. There definitely sounded like something was wrong with that engine. As we watched and counted the cement trucks as they slowly rumbled past us, we waited to spring into action. And just as the last one came into view, all 10 of us readied ourselves to pull the chariot out and onto the track. Then, as that last carriage was upon us and laboriously passing us, we shouted, "Now!" and emerged from our camouflage, running like a well-oiled machine, heaving the chariot onto the tracks, 2 of the boys lassoing the ropes around the buffers, Stumpy, Puffer and I leaping and taking our positions at the front of the chariot, holding on to the barrier, Puffer standing in the middle, resplendent in his monocle, a green velvet jacket, large purple floppy hat, and orange and yellow paisley cravat. And we readied ourselves for our journey. But then the train gave a sudden lurch, made a horrible screeching braking noise, and stopped, the engine itself giving a final great noise before it completely shut down, and then silence. Now, as the younger boys all dived back under cover, Stumpy, Puffer and I all stood on that chariot and had to make a split-second decision. Had we been rumbled? Should we scarper? It was Stumpy, daring to peer out from the side of the chariot, who held his nerve and made the decision for us. "The driver and his mate are inspecting something with the train. They're out on the track. I reckon it's an engine problem. Let's stay put," he hissed as quietly as possible. The wait was agonising. What were those drivers doing? Was the train stuck? Would they head our way? Should we stay? Or should we go? After a long 10 minutes or so, in which Stumpy recounted in hissed whispers to us what the drivers were doing, and whatever it was, it involved some sort of running mechanical repair. At last he reported that the drivers were getting back in the train. We heard a huge roar as the diesel started up, chugged loudly for a couple of minutes, and then, with a great jolt and with huge relief for us, the train lurched back into life, and slowly at first, we were off on our journey. But unbeknown to us, it was not to glory, but to hell. The first sign we knew our journey was not going to go to plan was when we started to pass by the run of raised chalk ridges, elevations and hillocks on which the large crowd of cheering admirers and Puffer fans that Stumpy had assembled were standing, with Stumpy and I waving and Puffer regally acknowledging their adulation with great sweeping flamboyant gestures. We noticed amongst their throng that several unsavoury characters had gathered and infiltrated, including some of our sworn and most recurring enemies, the Milton Sisters gang, led by those razor-lipped, suede-headed twins of terror, Mandy and Melanie Milton, with their sidekicks, Tin Ribs Wilson and Slugger Carson, all in their Fred Perry shirts and Doc Martens, and who, instead of cheering and waving, instead started hurling a collection of rotten and reeking vegetables at Puffer, and shouting derogatory and offensive insults, which I will not repeat here. Indeed, some shouts and bellows were so offensive amidst the booing that Puffer's portly face at one point went the colour of an exploding beetroot. Luckily, the train started to accelerate away, and we finally managed to escape the abuse and vegetative missiles of the mob. But it was this acceleration that represented the next spanner in our works, and which was to cause the main problem for us. For the train was getting faster and faster, indeed, much faster than we had ever known one of those trains to go, and as it began to terrifyingly gather speed and hurtle along the clattering tracks, we were all holding on to our barrier handlebars for dear life, feeling the awful metal clunking vibrations of the tracks as we shot over them. We all then horribly realised that the driver was obviously going at this alarming speed to make up for all the lost time from the earlier delays caused by the mechanical issues with the train. As we hurtled towards Skimpot Road Bridge, Stumpy shouted amidst the clatter, "Don't worry, it's got to slow down at the bridge." But the train didn't stop, instead hammering through as if driven by a maniac. And then, as that mighty diesel pulling those cement trucks clattered and roared over the bridge, came the disaster which would lead us into hell. For by now, we had been travelling so fast that the waxed rubber in the steel-ducted runners had, unbeknown to us, started to wear away at an alarming rate, and as we hit that bridge, their final thin form was finally eroded away, meaning that the steel duct pipes, which were the runners themselves, now hit the metal of the train tracks, causing a huge and appalling sound that, together with the roar and rumble of the train, was deafening. And because we were travelling so fast, we had no choice but to grip onto our barrier for dear life. We were unable to put our hands to our ears, thus causing the agonising sound to almost pierce our eardrums. And then, even more dreadfully, the long steel ducts themselves collapsed, meaning we were now hurtling along those tracks purely on the bare steel garage door. The noise was horrendous and ear-splitting. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, they did. For one of the basic elements of physics is that when thin metal is rubbed against metal and creates friction at great speed, it produces heat. To our great horror, we all now saw the silver bare metal garage door beneath our feet was turning red at its front. A great cascade of yellow sparks firing up and growing wisps of smoke rising. Stumpy shouted amidst the deafening din and clatter, "Look, it's burning up!" And we saw the bare metal now getting so hot it was turning red hot, like a moon rocket on its re-entry to Earth. Luckily, the soles of Stumpy's and my Adidas kick trainers offered some protection, even though we could both now feel our feet beginning to get hot. But poor Puffer, who was only wearing thin Shakespearean shoes, was clearly beginning to suffer. But none of us had any protection whatsoever against the heat that was now being transmitted up the thin tubular metal barrier we were still clasping onto. And as the heat began to increase at an alarming rate, it felt as if our hands were being welded into the metal. As Stumpy and I clasped on, our faces set fast in rictus grimaces, teeth banging with the thundering pace of the train, faces held in G-force expressions. Poor Puffer's plump face had now gone the colour of a dyed plum, and as we thundered on, he more and more resembled a bottle of ever-darkening cherryade waiting to pop. Even with this calamitous situation, though, Puffer was still able to put on a thespian's performance amidst the roar and inferno, a la Quatermass and the pit. "We're burning up, lads! We're burning up! We're going up in flames!" Faster and faster we went, hammering past trees, houses, factories, a coal depot, burning, 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 our ears deafened and feeling like they were going to explode, our hands raw and melting from holding the ever-increasing heat of the barrier, our feet smouldering on the garage door base. How long could we survive? How long could we hold on? We still don't know to this day how we survived that trip. For just as we all felt we would be slipping into blackness, miraculously, the train started slowing down, and as its speed now began to reduce as rapidly as it had first increased, we saw the railway tracks were now converging with numerous others, lines leading to sidings and holding stationary trains. We must have reached the destination of Luton Station, and in record time. As the heat from the barrier and garage door began to noticeably cool, the noise and clatter of our chariot floor, the steel garage door, beginning to rapidly diminish, the warm wind in our faces at last receding, Puffer's raised mercury thermometer of a face now thankfully calming, it began to dawn on us that, as the train reached its siding and finally slowed to a halt, we still had more problems to overcome. For heading towards us was a group of white-vested, burly, rough-house British rail workers, who had been looking on astonished and incredulous at the sight they saw. As they headed towards us, we thankfully were able to let go of the barrier with our melted hands and staggered in a punch-drunk fashion off the chariot. Realizing we had to somehow collect ourselves at lightning speed and think and act very fast, Puffer, despite the dreadful ordeal he in particular had just endured, pulled another masterclass of a role from his repertoire, and, readjusting his monocle, and doffing his floppy purple hat at them, stated and asked, "Good evening, gentlemen. We seem to have caught the wrong train. Is this Luton?" Then, staggering as nonchalantly as we could, like some survivors from a space wreckage, we stumbled across the network of lines as quickly as we could, taking advantage of the workmen being too stunned to follow, slipped through the trees and an open gate at the side of the tracks, and started off on the long walk back to Dunstable. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories. And don't forget to listen out for Stumpy and Gang's next adventure. For further information on all things Stumpy Sanderson, please visit www.stumpysanderson.co.uk. And you can also check out the Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories YouTube channel. But before we saddle up again on our rally choppers and tomahawks, let's take a listen to the strange little song that was specially written by Stumpy to accompany this podcast's tale. This song is performed for us now by Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s acoustic archive. Let's rock!
There's a freight train heading down the tracks and we like the look of it, 'cause it's heading straight for us and we like the look of it. Freight train rolling, freight train rolling. And as the wagons pass us by, we'll wave them on, we'll wave them on. And as the guard's van passes by, we'll wave it on, we'll wave it on. There's a freight train heading down the line and we like the look of it, 'cause it's carrying cement and lime and we like the look of it. Freight train rolling, freight train rolling. And as the wagons pass us by, we'll wave them on, we'll wave them on. And as the guard's van passes by, we'll wave it on, we'll wave it on. We'll wave goodbye, we'll wave goodbye, we'll wave goodbye. We'll wave goodbye, 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 we'll wave goodbye.